everyone. Thank you all for being here. So we essentially know that while the science has been giving us warnings about how bad the climate crisis is for some time, it's getting clearer and clearer about how little time we have left to start to solve the problem. So most recently, the UN scientists, some of the world's best scientists, put out a report saying that we have 12 years to limit warming to moderate levels. That's now a little bit closer to 11 years. And Senator Schatz, can you start us out with talking about how you see that science comparing to the current political environment right now from where you're seeing it in the Senate, but also where it could be in the next few years depending on the outcome of the 2020 presidential election?
Well, I think the politics is finally catching up with the science. And what I mean by that is two things. First of all, we need scale, we need magnitude, and we need sustained effort. So as much as everybody thinks that they should pass a carbon fee or cap and trade or a renewable portfolio standard nationally or whatever individual piece of legislation it is, we need to understand that this is going to be a sustained effort to transform the American economy and transform the global economy, which means it won't be just one bill. And if we frame it as though it's one bill, even the best bill will be a failure. And the worst bills will cause us to throw up our hands. And so we need to understand that this is a sustained effort to literally change our economy over time. And what has happened is young people recognize the threat. And young people have the moral authority that comes only from an intention to stay on this planet for another 60 or 70 years. And they're demanding action from all of us. So over just the last 6 months, I've seen the politics start to match the urgency of the scientific situation.
So you're on the Senate Select Committee on Climate Change. From what you understand from that committee on what it would take to match what scientists are saying is necessary, do you think that we're seeing the 2020 presidential candidates put out plans that are to that level that you're talking about so far?
Yes, and here's the thing. I personally favor, of course, everyone favors their own bill. I favor the bill that Sheldon Whitehouse and I have introduced for a carbon fee. I think it's the best way to go. But that's not what I'm looking for, is whether or not someone's individual bill matches up with my legislative approach. What I'm looking for is scale, ambition, seriousness, and a recognition that it's not about what we pass in 2021. It's about what we do in 2022 and from then on. So whether we're doing the Water Resources Development Act or whether the president is doing a bilateral meeting with China or whether we're doing reauthorization of the Lacey Act and dealing with the deforestation or whether states and counties and private sector actors are making the moves in the right direction, no one thing is going to solve this problem. All of the things together are going to solve this problem. And so I'm looking for presidential candidates that understand that this has to be a sustained effort over time. Sure, the first bill and the first proposal has to be up to it, but we shouldn't mistake that for the whole fight.
And so essentially what we've seen rolled out so far, we know that the Washington governor, Jay Inslee, has a plan for carbon neutrality by 2045. We know that Beto O'Rourke has a plan for carbon neutrality by 2045. But we basically just have those big outlines. Inslee has some more kind of markers along the way of how to get there. Tom, you were speaking a little bit earlier when we were chatting about kind of what your impression has been of how people are thinking about the scale of this problem at some of the conferences you've been at recently. Can you tell us if you think people are really understanding what's necessary?
Well, I think what Brian is talking about and what the UN study showed is that there's urgency. And I asked somebody who I think is the best climate engineer in the United States to express for me how to think about what we need to do by 2030 to avoid what the UN describes as catastrophic levels of global warming, which would be 2 degrees Celsius. And what he said was, as a globe, we need to reduce our carbon emissions every year by 32% by 2030. And currently they're going up by about 1.5% over the last 5 to 10 years. So when you think about what that means and what Brian's talking about in terms of how much of a change, the easiest way that I think of this is that's how much we need to change that much of our capital stock, whether it's cars or power plants or industrial plants, every single year, which is much more than you'd normally replace on a normal schedule. So the question you asked Brian was, does the political response reach the level of urgency that this problem poses for our society and our globe? And I would say, if you look at, we're starting to see competition between Democratic candidates for president to see who can have the biggest, smartest program, which I think is great. But I think what we have to face is there's an urgency in terms of time. If we get this right in 2045, that just doesn't work. So I think when we think about, is it sufficient, the plans are large. The plans are going to get larger. And I think the two things I'd say are, one, given what Brian said about how comprehensive a change this is going to be for our society, I don't think you can think about a climate or an energy program, because it has to be integrated into every other part of the way that you think about government in the United States of America. That's the first thing. This is not a climate or an energy program. This is a program that goes across employment and health and everything else. And the second thing is about timing. If we have the right idea, but we can't implement it in time, it's not just what happens in the United States. It's secondly, I don't think we can miss the extremely important point that if the United States wants to lead globally, we have to start by doing the right thing ourselves so that we can lead globally in the way that President Obama did to get the kind of global cooperation, since this is a global question. So the short answer to your question, Emily, with that extremely long preamble is, this is a heavy lift. It's going to require a gigantic effort of will, and I think it's up in the air whether, in fact, we can summon that will in time.
Well, and with the political schedule here in the U.S., it would take us a bit more time, a few more years, to get to the point where a new president could be in office, starting to work on these things, working with Congress to pass something. And there's the possibility that there won't be a new president in office. So what do we think could happen in that case? What do we think that Congress might be able to achieve under a second-term Trump presidency? And what might we see from states? I know Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, has recently joined the Climate Alliance. What does that mean for Wisconsin, and how quickly can you get your state's efforts off the ground to limit emissions?
Yeah, so it means a lot for Wisconsin. Unfortunately, we have a very hostile legislature that's not on board. But with that said, states like Wisconsin, states like Michigan, and also Minnesota and Illinois, as part of the Great Lakes region, we have a similar set of values. And knowing that we're together on this issue to move forward on the climate issue, where our legislature doesn't act, we have an opportunity with local government. And local government has a huge role to play. And you mentioned that politics is caught up to the science. Well, economics is also caught up to the science as well. And I think that's the more important part, because unfortunately, we are where we are because economics has led the conversation of our politics. And so with that being said, now you look at mayors in small to medium-sized towns, even larger cities, see that there is money to be saved if we change the way that we generate energy, meaning that our public spaces should be more energy efficient. That means buildings that are being put up with new tax credits for low-income housing. That's a wonderful opportunity. If we're gonna, as a state, if we're putting money up, then there should be an energy efficiency component to that, to all our new buildings. We shouldn't be building any new buildings that aren't energy efficient. And we also have to pay attention to communities that are adversely impacted by climate change. If you look at communities of color, oftentimes feel the impact 10 times worse than other communities, whether it's mining, whether it's coal burning power plants, the list goes on. And we need to make sure that every community is also part of the conversation, because there can be unintended consequences. And I think that's another reason why we are where we are and why communities have been so adversely impacted, because they haven't had a seat at the table. And so I'm proud to be helping lead this work in my state, because we have a role to play. The federal government, Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. However, I think there's enough energy in the states to make meaningful movement. In the same way that, absent of our legislature, I think that I know that our biggest cities in the state of Wisconsin, our largest towns, they are composed of a majority of the people of the state of Wisconsin. We can have more significant movement, and so we can do this without the legislature, and there's room to do that.
And your administration is starting a sustainability office, and just briefly, what sort of things might you do to make sure that the kind of communities that you're talking about are going to be involved in that process and in the goal for carbon-free electricity by 2050 that Wisconsin as your administration has talked about?
Yeah, and so with that being said, there wasn't already an office that exists. We're looking to move that office. It had been dormant for the last 8 years. If you don't know who our old governor was, this wasn't an issue that he paid particular attention to. I mean, we were one of those states where the words climate change was scrubbed from state websites. Our Department of Natural Resources, scientists, either they were retiring or they were leaving early because they couldn't do the work that they dedicated their lives to. So with that being said, this new Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy is going to be tasked with making sure that we are at that goal. Yes, 2050. It is a long time from now. However, it's one of those things where I feel like you get to a point where you get to 25, 35%, the wheels start moving a little bit faster. Because at that point, it becomes the more economically viable way to generate energy. So with that said, we have to make sure that our state buildings, we are leading by example. State-owned buildings are going to be more energy efficient. And we have to have an office to oversee that work, sort of lead an interagency council to make sure that the state is a leader in that work. Also making sure that, whether it's the Wisconsin Housing Economic Development Association that gives out those tax credits, whether it's, looking at our capital budget and construction on campuses, that is where we can have the biggest impact. And that is what that office is going to lead on. That's how that office is going to be effective. And like in Michigan, for example, they have a public advocate office, or they have a public advocate position in their office of environmental justice. I mean, that's where the conversation is right now. And it's exciting to see candidates see who can be the boldest on climate change right now. It's unfortunate that we are in this climate crisis that we're in, but it is great to see so many people paying attention to it. And if you're not on the right side of the climate justice fight, you are going to be on likely the losing side of an election.
Well, let me just add something about climate justice, because the Lieutenant Governor is really hitting on something critically important for the movement. And I consider myself a member of the climate movement since adulthood. And one of the flaws in the movement is we have not been inclusive. It has been primarily people on the coasts and people who were configuring solutions that were largely technocratic, that could have ended up being derivatives or some kind of financial instrument traded on Wall Street. And both as policy and as politics, that was a failure. There has to be a paint a picture and paint me in it. So if you're going to do this, what do I get for this? Because I understand climate change in the abstract is an important priority, but how do I benefit, right? If I'm in a rural area in Wisconsin, or if I'm in Milwaukee, or if I'm in Detroit, or if I'm in rural West Virginia, what do I get out of this? And that's not a sort of secondary thing that we trade once we're in conference committee, which is the way it used to be thought of, is like, well, how do we kind of like deal with the fact that there's going to be dislocation? We have to start as an organizing principle with communities of color and people who are disproportionately impacted by these environmental problems. And especially in this kind of intersectional progressive movement, the climate movement has to catch up to that and recognize that young people and people of color have to be at the core of the movement for moral reasons, but also for practical political reasons.
So let me say one thing about this. In California, we've been doing this for a long time, and we have the most progressive energy laws in the world. And if you look as recently as 2017, when we reauthorized cap and trade, which was a year-long, very difficult fight, it started with exactly where Mandela started and what Brian's talking about, which is, how is this going to work for the people in the poorest districts in this state? And in fact, the reauthorization of cap and trade in California was led by legislators from the very poorest legislative districts. And the answer was that A, as Mandela said, they were disproportionately hurt by pollution, so the money we raised from cap and trade went disproportionately to their residents and their communities to mitigate for that and to pay back for that. Second of all, there's always been a huge jobs component. It's a question of who gets those jobs, but that in fact we have over 500,000 jobs in California on clean energy. But Brian's point is the critical point, which is you can't get there at the end. You have to be there at the very beginning and have leadership so that the coalition is completely different. And I'll finish by saying one thing, which I think I said here in 2010, which is the #1 group in America that cares about energy, climate, pollution, the environment is Latinos. The number 2 group is African Americans, and the number 3 group is Asian Americans. So when we think about what this coalition looks like, who should be leading it, where, kind of how we should be thinking about it, let's remember that there's a very inaccurate vision in America about who cares about the environment. It's in some ways very disrespectful, but it's certainly unsuccessful and incomplete.
Yeah, and just say one quick thing too, because in Wisconsin, most of our energy is generated from coal. We don't have any coal in Wisconsin. We don't have any oil in Wisconsin. We are literally just sending money, $12 billion annually out of state, which is probably a small number for California, but that's still $12 billion annually we send out of the state of Wisconsin. And there's also one thing we should consider too when we talk about clean energy, because there are forms of clean energy that are negatively impacting some communities too, like hydroelectric in Canada. First Nation communities have been their land has been taken over essentially to generate hydroelectric energy. So we got to be very conscious, and that's again why we have to have all communities at the table. And when I say cities, towns, and villages, that also means tribal communities.
So we haven't mentioned it yet, but what you're talking about touches on a lot of what you see in the proposal for the Green New Deal, which at this point is, I like to call it a vision, right? It's not legislation yet. It's technically a resolution that a lot of members of Congress have signed on to. But it seems to have reframed the discussion around not what will you give up to fight climate change, but what could you gain from fighting climate change and what could communities gain? But I want to come back to this question of the politics catching up to the science, right? Because getting to something like a Green New Deal would mean that the politics would have to catch up to the science. There would have to be agreement on this underlying problem existing and it being a crisis at the scale that scientists say that we're approaching. So this morning I was watching a House Natural Resources Subcommittee hearing where Republicans called witnesses who are very well-known climate change deniers. That's what all of their work is, to talk about the benefits that they see in higher carbon dioxide levels. And we know that's not true of all Republicans. Many Republicans are acknowledging climate change as a threat and talking about what can be done, although the ideas look very different than Democrats. But there are still a lot of Republicans who are in that space. So how do you work with people who are in that space? How quickly do you think it could change? And especially with the sorts of things that we're talking about, even with a Democrat for president, legislation would be required. So how do you get legislation passed with that political hurdle?
We have to win. We have to win next year, and that is. There are a lot of sort of procedural forks in the road, and there are a lot of tactical decisions to be made in 2021. If Senator Schumer is the leader of the United States Senate, there are parliamentary questions. There are questions related to reconciliation and the filibuster and all of that, and including policy questions about whether we're going to do, a national RPS or a carbon fee or a Green New Deal or whatever. But all of that is moot if we don't win. And so I am not interested in spending too much time negotiating with climate deniers. There are a few Republicans in the Congress that have come around on this, but now is not the time to try to cut a deal with them while Mitch McConnell leads the Senate. We have to focus all of our energies towards setting the table so that we can be successful in the next election. And then we know that we're still at the beginning of the process, because the difficulty here, and I'll just mention one fight we had, which was Keystone, which was a nice galvanizing moment. The problem with Keystone was when Keystone was finally rejected, lots of activists felt like they had solved something. And what we need is a sustained effort to fix this problem over decades, which means first we have to win, and then we need to legislate, and then we've taken one step up a very, very high mountain, but we got to start.
So not every Democratic candidate, though, is going to propose an ambitious, sweeping plan for dealing with climate change. And a lot of the questions currently are about what we could see from former Vice President Joe Biden after a story circulated about his potential to take a sort of middle-of-the-road approach that could include fossil fuels still. So what happens then if you either have a Trump presidency or you have a Democrat in the White House who's might not, I'm not saying this is the case for this particular person, but might not have climate change as their first priority?
I'll say it this way, somewhat diplomatically, because all of my friends are running for president, and that's probably the reason I'm on this couch. And that is, I do not think we will have a presidential nominee who has insufficient ambition on climate. I do not think that will happen. And I I'm not going to sit there and sort of rank order. Someone will, but I'm not going to rank all of the climate plans.
Someone did that in my inbox earlier
Someone
today.
already
actually,
did that,
yes.
I'm sure. I'm sure the candidates themselves are ranking the plans. But I will just say that I can't imagine that we will have a nominee that is not up to this task, because I think we understand this is the challenge of a generation, and because voters are demanding it.
I think that we have time for a very brief audience question. Question, not statement, please. If you raise your hand, there are microphones going around. This gentleman in the front here. Thank you.
Hi, John Vane. Most climate models, depending on which ones you believe, suggest that if we cut off greenhouse emissions today, that the planet's going to still heat for between 50 and 300 years. What that tells me is not that we shouldn't try to decrease emissions, but unless we develop technologies that will extract carbon from the atmosphere and the oceans and sequester it, we're in deep trouble. So what actions are you guys looking to advance those technologies?
I'll just be quick on that. I think carbon capture has to be part of the equation. I think even the people who advocate for carbon capture are imagining that it'll deal with about 1% of the carbon. And so, but that's not to argue against it, because you could sort of make the same argument about conservation and efficiency and restoration of ecosystems and wind and solar. Nothing is enough. Nothing is enough. Only if you do all of the things is it enough. We have the same conversation, especially on Twitter, about, well, if you're not for nuclear, you're not really for climate action. My view is we should do all of the things, and none of those things are going to be enough, but all of them together will save the planet.
I mean, the obvious one that people talk a lot about is not just ending deforestation, but using reforestation, different agricultural techniques in terms of putting carbon back into the soil that has systematically been taken out of it over the last 400 years in North America. And those are things that actually make a huge difference on a short-term basis, meaning 40 years, but that give us room to develop the techniques on a cost-effective basis. Because the issue about carbon capture, there are many practical issues that Brian's indirectly referring to in terms of cost, storage, and size of the project, which is immense. So when we think about this, the most obvious thing we can do is to restore nature's ways of sequestering carbon, and that's something that can happen reasonably significant and reasonably quickly.
And just like you said, there's not one thing. It's going to take a collection of everything. It's going to take a collection of every community being involved and being integrated into this work. I'm glad you mentioned, too, like the soil remediation, because there is a tremendous role for our agriculture community to play, especially with carbon capture, whether in biodigestion or biodigestion as well. In communities where where there's new building construction going on, a lot of our downtown areas they are starting to boom all across the country. You can use circular economy tactics where we again connect communities that are far away from each other in idea and in distance, but however share common ideas and also a space for them to work together in ways they could have never imagined before.
I think we're about at time, but can we very quickly do a little lightning round here? If you can each tell me in like one sentence, what is something that you see being developed right now, policy or otherwise, that really gives you hope that the world will be able to meet this challenge?
You want me to start?
Sure.
You're looking at me.
One sentence.
The key to this will be a broad coalition of Americans understanding what we're trying to accomplish together, both in terms of energy, but more broadly, how it fits into a positive vision for the future.
And I'll use the conversation we had backstage about infrastructure. This is the real infrastructure conversation that we should be having. Anytime people talk about infrastructure, it could absolutely be based on green infrastructure as well.
The thing that makes me most excited and most hopeful is young people demanding action. And I think a lot of people in this room, and certainly the three of us on this panel, have been working on climate for a long time. And I like the pressure. I like people coming to me and saying, well, it's nice that you've been working on this for 20 years, but how's that been going? And you're not doing enough. And I think we all need to recognize we have not been doing enough. And there's a generation of people that are demanding that as much as we've been working on this, that it hasn't been getting it done, and we've got to get it done very shortly.
Well, you heard him. Senator Schatz wants all the young people in his office. Thank you, everyone.